And we're on. Okay. Hi, today is May 21st, 2014, and this is the fifth in a series of classes on Mr. LaRouche's textbook, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. Today we're going to be covering the end of Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 on energy and work and on monetary theory, which is actually, Lynn wrote the chapter, it's hilarious. But I wanted to start today by going over the homework from the last couple of sessions, because I know we didn't do that last week. From the homework from Chapter 4, in general, people did a good job on the transitive and intransitive verbs. One that tricked people several times was the sentence, "We are very tired today." The verb in that sentence is are, and it's intransitive. And then also, it rained so much yesterday. You know, unless you're raining things on people, or you know, raining is intransitive. So that was good. On the whole discussion about trying to figure out how much of the economy was in C and V and D and S prime, that was really, I think, really fun for everybody who participated in doing that. Both for finding out some numbers, and it's great to be proud of actually figuring out how the economy breaks down, and then also realizing how impossible it is to really get a good answer on that using government statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, also known as the Bureau of Lies and Statistics, or BS with an L in the middle of it, gives statistics about how people are employed, but it doesn't give much about, well, it doesn't give anything about production. It's about labor, it's about people. And when we get to Chapter 8, you might find those statistics more useful, because we're going to be talking about the population. But for the bar diagrams and the production, the census has an economic census in addition to a census of people, and that's got some good data, but better data. But this is one of the best responses. I thought this was funny. On the question of figuring out the breakdown of the economy, someone wrote in, "This task was frustrating and the outcome completely imprecise. If I were in charge of national accounting statistics, I would light the BLS on fire and outlaw the acronym GDP. Then I would hire an army of meticulous engineers to tour the country, surveying the productive capabilities of our nation and hunting down all Wall Street degenerates, using large nets if necessary. Every quarter, national newspapers would print regional and national statistics on the basis of so you wish methods. The people would rejoice at being told the truth for once." So that's very good advice, burning down the BLS, or at least firing everybody, and then no longer using the word GDP for anything related to economy, considering how ridiculous it is. People who did the homework found out that 80% of workers, employed people, are not doing anything productive. Supposedly 20% are. However, based on changes in the classifications of employment in industry, working at McDonald's and making hamburgers is considered assembly or manufacturing. Just like if you're putting together a refrigerator or a artificial hand for somebody who is injured, if you're, you know, adding cheese to a burger, you are an assembly worker. So good for you for being part of industry. You know, if you, one of these funny things, if you look at like the Dow, the top companies in the Dow, you know, who's on the Dow index. It used to be like General Motors, General Electric. Now it's, you know, like Disney, you know, Apple. So one of the answers that people came up with was that currently 20% of production is in C, capital goods that would be part of the productive process. 8% is in V, household goods to support the households of productive workers. And 72% in D, or overhead, having nothing to do with production. It's very tough to get, you know, that's a good estimate for starters. It's very tough to try to start with money figures and then try to turn it into something physical, which makes it almost impossible to really get good economic data right now. You know, 30 years ago it was easier. The money wasn't quite such a sham, but today it's just ridiculous. The homework questions from before about how different occupations and the work would fit in for C and V and D, that went well. I'll just give a couple of examples that people put. A nurse is E, overhead, medical. Let's see here. A photographer is overhead, but what kind of photographer? Do they do forensic photography, or do they work for Playboy? One of them was banker. Overhead, D, institutional. Unless he's a usurious bastard, then it's waste. A welder is V for his household consumption and C for his production and maintenance work. Unless he is welding Obama's prison cell shut, then he would be a hero. So, and then here's a good one, the mechanic. And we'll come back to this in chapter 8. What is the, where in C and V and D and S prime does a mechanic fit in? And this person wrote, they were V for consumption, for maintaining their household, and C for maintenance or production. Unless he's helping a pimp, then it would be D for criminal waste. So that's leading to something we'll get to later, that the work of a mechanic depends on, well, what kind of vehicle are they working on? Are they repairing a concrete truck? Are they repairing the car of a pimp? Are they repairing the car of a mall executive? Where your work fits in isn't what you're doing always. It's actually what's the economic process that it's participating in, which is how economic value works. So let's just move ahead then to, actually a couple more answers about the question on capital intensity versus energy flux density. I thought this one was interesting. It was about organic farming, where organic farming is a lower energy flux density than conventional farming. It's hard to think about fertilizers and pesticides as being energy flux density, because you don't think about using lasers to shoot bugs off of crops so they don't eat them. But if you think about it as a higher technology being involved, when you do organic farming, it's actually more capital intensive. In terms of the labor that has to go in per pound of food, it's more capital intensive than conventional, and it's at a lower energy flux density. So that was some review from 2 weeks ago, and then from last week, the class went very well, and to review some of the homework from that, the first one was to look at advertisements. And now if you'll take a look at, it's probably just showing up as my face if you're on Hangouts, or you see it now if you're on YouTube. This is an advertisement. People were supposed to compare advertisements from the 1930s and today. So here's an advertisement for women's clothing in the 1930s. It's nice, some clothes, and women are wearing them and looking happy about it. Here's an ad for stockings in the 1930s, and it's describing the quality of them, they're a good value, etc. And then, it's kind of embarrassing to even show it, but an American Apparel advertisement, where what is being advertised with this image? It's not actually the product. It is a totally disgusting image of what you're supposed to feel like if you purchase this product, which in the case of these things, is as the person who sent that in said, is basically trying to look like a prostitute who's on crack or on meth. Let's get this image back here. So, okay, so that was good. The responses about concentration span generally had something in common, which was when you're losing your concentration span, people talked about different techniques they use to have some sort of a mental break, to get out of what you're stuck in and come back from the top, to think about yourself in history, think about your long-term identity, or just take a walk or a whiz and get your mind loosened up. On the question about educating contacts, I thought this was a great answer. Somebody had written in, here's the question, do your contacts depend on you for education? Do they organize others? Anastasia wrote, yes. I think that's the whole point of organizing. If you aren't reproducing ideas, you aren't doing a very good job changing society. People need to be able to make a discovery, to take it out and change other people as well. when they discover an idea, that's where inspiration comes from. The examples for the hypothesis, higher hypothesis, and the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis were, and I'll send these out also, most of the homeworks. There's some excerpts. They were pretty good. One of them was using let me read this, a simple hypothesis from organizing. Here it is. If humans continue to use up their resources, we will grow overpopulated and go extinct. That's deductively consistent. It's based on the axioms of not making technological progress, and it's a conclusion that you would draw from that. It's a simple hypothesis. A higher hypothesis would be about developing new resources, making discoveries to do that. Other examples people used were Kepler's vicarious hypothesis, where he directly proved that axioms were wrong and not conclusions. And there was some discussion about, another answer was that a protester was making a simple hypothesis, and working with a political action committee is a higher hypothesis. So a lot of things to think about here. The questions about giving briefings, question I think 6 it was about giving a briefing on Ukraine, one from the standpoint of events and one from the standpoint of processes. And those were very good answers overall. You know, where you really get the sense of, you could try to describe Ukraine the way the news does, as events causing each other, but what we're able to do is start from the top and, you know, go back to Lynn right after Gaddafi was killed, saying this is the direction of this is World War III, and Ukraine's being used for that right now, but it's not necessarily the only possible cause of that. If the intent is that war, Ukraine fits in that context, not the other direction around. And then on the science driver question, it was good. Almost everybody talked about a metric for whether the science driver is useful. Saying a science driver is an initiative from the nation that needs to increase potential relative population density. It should increase energy flux density. It will improve mankind, improve the economy overall. It does mean doing something that's hard, not easy, but it has to. You have to have a sense of what the point of it is. I mean, you know, if we decided to make the whole country go solar, that would be hard work. It would probably involve some advancements in solar panels, but it would not be a science driver. It would be a big waste. So, with that that was kind of lengthy, but that's some feedback from the last homeworks. So let's go ahead and get into the content of what we're going to talk about today, which is partly Chapter 6 on energy and work. Just say a little bit about that because Leona had touched on it, work versus energy. I mean, Leona had touched on it last week, and I thought got a good start. So I'm just going to point out 3 things from it. One was that we could think about the measure that Lynn gives for energy flux density. He says you can think of kilowatt degrees per square meter. Now, earlier, I think we had been talking about or sort of using kilowatts per square meter. In other words, a flow of energy, you know, in a certain area, energy flux density. Lynn's bringing up that by thinking in terms of degrees is a general way of getting at the quality of the energy. So it's not just concentrating it, you also have what kind of quality of energy are you talking about. So that's a good concept. Then the other thing that I think the Ukraine question did a good job of addressing was when Lynn talks about the problems with quarks and with elementary particles. To say a little bit about that, when Lynn's talking about quarks here, it's not quarks in particular that he's upset about or that he's polemicizing against. It's, as he says, that if we can build up all of our understanding of physics from particles whose characteristics we're able to understand and then explain their interactions with other particles in terms of that the system would be intrinsically entropic. So Lynn just jumps all the way to the end on this one. There's a lot of ways you can approach the problems of building things up from particles. You know, you might say, how would Curler discuss that? You know, what did Planck and Einstein think about the problems of quantum theory? And then Lynn goes right to the top with it And he says, well, if everything were understood in terms of particles, and there were no fields, there were no processes as fundamentals, then the universe would be entropic. Does anybody know why that is? Can anybody care to say anything about that? How can Lynn make the claim that all doctrines bearing the assumption of existence as self-evident solid elementary particles are analogous to an algebra consistent with the axiomatic assumptions of the self-evident existence of numbers? All such systems are intrinsically entropic. Why are those systems intrinsically entropic?
I'm just making sort of an educated guess, but is it because they run down like I don't know, like a burning ember, or just that you do have there is an idea that that's how the universe works. You have the Big Bang, and we're just out here floating around using this energy that's eventually going to dry up. And with an entropic system, there is no means to refuel the process.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Also, if you have fixed particles, then how is matter being created? Because we know from science now that any state of matter is only temporary, and we know from things like, because if you just have a domino-like causality, then everything is going to, it's like the dominoes finally are going to come to an end when all matter interferes with each other until there's nothing left from the Big Bang to keep it moving. But we know, like for instance, from Seyfert galaxies, that these things are being born. There's new galaxies being born.
Okay. I think those are a couple of good approaches to it. Maybe this would make a good homework problem, especially to draw out that analogy where he says that having those self-evident particles would be analogous to an algebra consistent with axiomatic assumptions. Because this is something that Lynn's been talking about a lot recently, about 1900, and about the turn away from science towards mathematics and axiomatizing things. And the point he's been making there is a general one, which is that if our understanding of the universe is that we're going to find a final answer, then, you know, if we're going to be able to have a determinate, basically with quantum theory is interesting because it's the end of determinism. You know, that's how people see it. That determinism meaning that if we know what's occurring at this moment, we can know exactly what will occur in the next moment. And before Planck and the quantum world, that was considered to be just a very natural idea of what causality was. That causality meant, you know what's going on, you know what will occur in the future. We can, you know, extrapolate the process forward. And Planck showed that that was just not working. And Einstein showed that was just not working in the quantum world. The purported solution to that is to just introduce randomness. So yes, down in the small, probabilities are real, the same way that, you know, real properties seem real in the macroscopic world, but individual events are inherently, irreducibly, unhelpably random. So you've got this sort of interesting boundary between determinism and randomness, and well, how does development fit into either of those? Determinism isn't creative. Randomness isn't creative. Some people might think it is. So, you know, where, for example, what kind of world could human beings and creativity exist in? So if you're trying to put together a theory of everything that excludes that, then you know that there has to be something wrong with it. So let's keep. I'm going to leave that one sitting, I think, in that state. I think it's a really good homework question or something to think about more. And then let's really focus here on chapter 7, which is I think this is a really fun chapter. So we're going to be reading some quotes from it. I'll read the first one, but then if you've got your book available, I'll ask people to read some of the other quotes. So Lynn starts this chapter, which he calls chapter 7, a chapter dispensing with monetary theory. He says, most of what passes for modern expertise in economics is not unfairly compared to pulling your trousers down over your head as the first step to pulling them up your legs. From the starting point of physical economy's ABCs, as much of contemporary economics textbook material as is worth studying can be reduced to a week or so of study. It's not a diplomatic thing to say, but it's the plain truth. Accordingly, we devote a single chapter of this text to the supposed mysteries of monetary theory. And then he says, first, as to the general state of monetary theory today, what passes for economics in textbooks and professional journals today is essentially nothing more than monetary theory. Now that's absolutely true. I mean, if you've sat in an economics class or taken one or talked to economists, it's basically just money. Physical economy is not there at all. And like we've had these stories about what it's like talking to economists. GDP and money measures are the ones that are used. And even when people try to look at physical aspects of the economy, it's always measured in terms of money. And there are major impossibilities that arise when you're trying to do that. So Lynn says there's two major errors with this contemporary monetary theory. He says the first one is the magic of the marketplace. That people try to explain everything about economics from price theory. So, it's almost like saying the magic of the marketplace, that if prices all work out and people try to make money and that'll explain everything that there is to know, it makes about as much sense as saying that poetry is the magic of words, or a speech is the magic of letters, or the magic of diction, that cooking is the magic of ingredients, that physics is the magic of quartz, and that music is the magic of notes. I mean, in any of these things, you take one visible and measurable aspect of something, which is a shadow of what generated it and what it actually evokes, and then you try to understand it in terms of those things. So, do poems have meter? Yes. Most do. Most intend to have one. Or do we use letters to write words? Of course. Are there notes and pieces of music? Naturally. But obviously, but if you try to understand music by putting them together, like if you hear a MIDI file, for example, it's not music. Or people who perform music, if you don't really get what's going on in the song, it's going to sound like notes. It ends up, I'm sure a lot of us have had this experience of just sounding like, we're being very notey and not really getting across what's meant. Or if you're reading a poem and you really don't get what's going on, it just kind of sounds like some words that you're adding a little bit of, poetic language to, or, a poetic presentation. Like if you go on YouTube and you look at people who are presenting Shakespeare sonnets, you can get a lot of that, of people where they're just trying to enunciate and roll their R's, but you realize, some of these people don't have any clue what they're saying. So, same thing with money. Do we use money? Of course. Should we go back to a barter system so that we're not using this foul money stuff? No, that would be obviously incredibly inconvenient and stupid, and you wouldn't have an ability to have credit. But money's a shadow. The second major error, Lynn points out, is that a lot of monetary theory, it's not an academic theory at all. It's not from economists trying to figure out how an economy works and coming to conclusions. It's people who are trying to steal and have political control, making up economic theories that support what they're doing politically. And that's the vast majority of what you get. And these people like Adam Smith, He's not an ivory tower academic. This is the British East India Company. So Lynn says if you clear out all of this stuff, if you clear out the presumption that you can figure everything out in terms of prices and money, and if you clear out the defense of usury and the political use of economics as a science, introducing things just to legitimize theft and oligarchy, then it's actually not so complicated. He says, if these immoral and destructive practices are outlawed, the theoretical difficulties associated with accounting for the day-to-day effects are eliminated at the source. And then the valid principles of monetary theory are reduced in scope and can be covered in one chapter of an economics book. So then he gets into the meat of the matter, and he starts with, and this is really polemical, he starts talking about monetary theory in terms of Franklin, Hamilton, and the Careys. Now today, people would say that that wasn't monetary theory; it was credit, right? But Lynn's saying, no, he says that's the real birth of that's an actual science between monetary theory. So he looks at what some of the example problems would be. For example, if the money in your economy is pretty well matched to what you're producing, to the annual productivity of the economy, he brings up what he calls the buyback problem, which is where is the money to account for S prime? In other words, if we have the potential to do more with an economy, to produce an increasing S prime over what's part of the energy of the system, what will cause it to be made if there's no more money for it? In other words, how would you use that ability to do more than you currently are if a lack of money is preventing it? He says, well, a couple ways. One of them is you can tax overhead more, or you can simply make money. Now, there's nothing wrong with making money in the, in the sense of a government actually producing it. And the ability to do that is essential. I mean, if you could look at the difference between a gold reserve system and a gold standard, for example. And this will also be one of the homework questions. So what's the difference between them? So it's a really important thing. There's a lot of people talking about a gold system today, or a gold standard, and it's not at all what Lynn wants, and it's really nothing like a gold reserve system. Under a gold standard, the amount of dollars you can print or create in other ways is limited to the amount of yellow metal that you have. So your economy and the ability to get credit and make it available to use the potential for S prime and invest in developing the economy for the future, that would be limited to whether you have enough gold in the country or not to produce the money, the credit to make it possible. So you're tying your economy to metal. People say, well, it's more real than just fiat dollars, they'll say, but there's nothing. It doesn't make any sense. Under a gold reserve system, the gold is used for taking care of net debts to other countries. So, for example, if you've got under the old Bretton Woods system, for example, let's say the United States and Mexico have got various trade deals. There's agricultural products going back and forth. There's petroleum products going back and forth. There's machinery going back and forth. And then by the purchase of pesos and dollars between the two currencies, at the end of the year, there is an accounts deficit. One country will have more of the other country's currency because they've bought more imports from that country. The way that would get settled between two countries is by a transfer of gold. Whether you actually move the gold or you just change who you say it belongs to sitting in a bank basement somewhere, that's the gold reserve standard that Lynn is proposing in this book, where money isn't just something that has any old value and is completely disconnected with anything. It is tied to the value of gold, which maintains a certain stability that prevents it from flying all over the place, but it does not limit your internal ability to create credit. Because internal credit creation, if, for example, it had no net effect on imports and exports, wouldn't have any bearing on these gold settlements between other nations. So under a gold reserve system, you're internally sovereign, and you are able to produce credit. when there are projects that have a definite physical economic payback that might be held up for not having money to put into accounts to make the machinery work and make it happen, which would be a pretty silly reason not to do something that would benefit people's lives if there's not money available for it. So anyway, so then Lynn talks about how are we going to get, and this is really important for today, because so what do we need to do? We need Glass-Steagall to end the bailout, to disconnect Wall Street, and basically pull that gigantic tick off of the dog of the economy, and then go, throw it somewhere and step on it and squirt it or whatever. And then if we're going to have national banking and a credit system, Lynn goes through how credit gets created here in this chapter. And he says, well, there's a few criteria he gives for the introduction of new credit, of new currency into the economy. First, he says these loans, this generation of credit, should go only to physical production or to basic infrastructure. Among production, it really ought to be preferred if it goes into the making of capital goods. That is, government credit in general should not be heading towards a new shoe factory. Instead, if it's heading to a new sawmill or the production of a new steel yard, something like that, where you're producing other capital goods. And the highest, best place is in machine tooling. Because there you get, the further upstream in the economy that you go, the impact of introducing a higher potential technology gets spread more broadly throughout the economy. So if you have a new technology which is being applied only to consumer products at the very end, okay, maybe they'll be cheaper or better. But if you can apply it to machine tooling and have a precision and a capability that expands through your whole economy, or with infrastructure, where the more efficient infrastructure spreads everywhere throughout the economy, it has a much bigger impact than if you're investing that ability to create new credit into things that'll have a consumer goods production component. And then he said only in real emergencies should we ever use credit for consumer goods themselves. That is, emergency food relief or materials goods relief in a real crisis. That should really only be a very short-term thing. So that's his first criteria. Currency needs to go into things that are going to be productive, either through direct production or through infrastructure, which increases the productivity of the whole economy. So the second one, I guess the second one we actually just talked about already, which is we should lean towards high-tech capital goods. We should prefer production of more capital goods and focus on machine tools. And the third criterion, this is really good, because this gets into how it'll work with banks. Now, for one thing, sometimes people make this point to us in Congress. They say, this would be a great time for all of your projects. You want to build this, you want to build that. A few months ago they'd say you want to build NAWAPA, you want high-speed rail, you want to build nuclear power plants. This is a great time because money is so cheap. Because it is. Right now, money is really cheap. The interest rates are incredibly low. Like, even if you want to get a loan for a house, I think it's below 1%. Money is incredibly cheap right now. But it shouldn't be, right? This is an effect of, we got the whole quantitative easing, just spit out money everywhere. Imagine that we've ended that, right? Obama's out. We are reorganizing the Treasury. Interest rates shouldn't be, 0%. You're not able to direct currency flows in the economy if money's free. So let's imagine that we had an interest rate of 5%. So for these examples, let's just say it's 5%. So Lynn says that here's how this would work. The government would create currency, and then they would loan it to a bank, let's say at 2%. That bank could only get the government loans at the very low interest rate if the bank itself is giving loans to businesses that are in approved categories. So if the government has said, we're making credit available for, and I know this is very general, this is we can talk about how this would be applied specifically today, but it's a general point that's true. The bank says, okay, we've got some categories that we're allowed to give these special loans to. So a local business, comes and says, you know, the city says that they're going to be replacing some of the bridges in the city, for example. Or a business says that they're going to be replacing their machinery. No, they want to get a loan, they produce metal fittings, and they want to upgrade their equipment. The bank would say, perfect. They would get a loan from the federal government, from the Treasury, for like 2%. They would end up giving it a loan to the business, let's say at 4%, but one of the conditions from the Treasury is that the bank has to put its own money in as well. So the way it would work, you know, this is a lot of numbers, but it's good to know this stuff. So you get the bank's getting money from the Treasury at 2%. They've got their own deposits. They've got their own money that came from depositors. That is, let's say, it's at 5 or 6%. They're able to loan it out to this business at 3 or 4%. So instead of the usual 5 or 6%, the business that's getting the special credit pays a lower interest rate, and the government is really only having to put half of the credit up for it because they're requiring the bank to use their deposits for the other half. So in this way, you are you're engaging the banks in it. You're ensuring that people who've got money in the banks that it's actually going to something useful. You're making loans that are cheaper for these preferred categories that you want to invest in to get the economy to grow in a large way. And that's basically, you know, he describes from page 129 to 130. Actually, could somebody read the paragraph that spans page 129 to 130?
Sure.
Okay.
The mechanisms are simple. A private bank submits a proposed loan agreement with a preferred category of investor to the relevant agency of the Federal Reserve System, for example, which acts for the Treasury in this matter. On approval of the loan by that agency, the Federal Reserve draws a check against the currency issue deposited with it by the Treasury. This check is issued to the lending bank. The check is deposited to the account of the borrower in that bank. The borrower is then permitted to draw upon that account with checks countersigned by the relevant officer of the bank against approved categories of purchases consistent with the investment purpose for which the approved form of the loan agreement specifies. The currency issued is thus circulated to the seller of the specified categories of goods, services, and payrollees. In this way, the currency issues are conduit to the purpose of circulating the free energy ration of national output. Is that it?
Yep. That's might be either clear as a bell or clear as mud, depending on whether you've been thinking about this stuff much. Is that how? Is that?
Be worth walking through it.
Worth working through it. Okay. Let's. Is that? Where are people with that? Is that? Is this kind of? Does this seem clear? Does it seem totally confusing? Any thoughts on that? Should we work through it again?
You might want to make some of the terminology clear.
Okay.
It kind of sounds how the basic functioning of a bank where you deposit money and then how it's worked within the system of the bank. Because, I mean, you deposit money and the bank actually uses your money to give out loans to other people who need a loan because they want to set up a business or something, and then but they don't necessarily have the immediate money, so they loan that the money that you have as deposited in your bank account, so that they have the money, but they'll get that back to you as an issuance of agreement that they will have that money for you if you need it. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, that's how, I mean, that's what banks exist to do generally. I mean, they don't really do this anymore, is the weird thing. You sort of have to imagine, you know, what's that charming movie with Frank Capra with the It's a Wonderful Life. You know, the bank, what was the guy's name? Banker? Jimmy Stewart.
Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, and he had some, yeah, like Jimmy Stewart, the banker, and, you know, and It's a Wonderful Life. Like, he's nothing like, you know, Lloyd Blankfein or something like this. That was an old-fashioned bank that, yes, people said they had some money. I mean, you think about banks. Banks are a wonderful invention. Like, banks aren't inherently evil and terrible. Wall Street is evil and terrible, but the concept of a bank is not. Banks are great. People have got money, which represents a capital ability that they're not doing anything with. You pool it together. Like, imagine your town. People have got more than they need at the moment. You put it together into a bank, and then you're able to loan it out to somebody who's got an idea, some venture, some investment to make in what they're doing that'll make them more productive. It makes sense. You know, using money instead of thinking in terms of the resources that would be made available, but it's basically the same thing. You're able to pool resources that otherwise are sitting idle and use them to accomplish something that one person isn't able to do on their own. They're not able to finance or get the resources for on their own. So the bank helps make that possible. So you put your money in the bank, and they pay you for giving it to them because, you know, like Jenny said, they're giving out loans. So just to use, like, if interest rates weren't zero, you know, imagine you went to a bank, you gave them $100. They say, if you let us have this $100 for a year, we'll pay you $4 for that. Meanwhile, they're lending that $100 to somebody. Well, they're probably, you know, lending more than $100. You know, say they're lending $1,000 to somebody who needed a loan, and your $100 being loaned to that guy, the bank gets back $106. The bank keeps $2. That's how much money they made for, you know, doing, you know, working all this out, doing their legitimate, you know, banking. They get $2 out of it. You get $4 out of it, and that person paid only $6 to have the privilege of using $100 to do whatever kind of investment they wanted to do. That's basically what a bank ought to do. The $2 for the bank, also, some of those loans aren't going to get paid back. So that's also why the, you know, the bank, each loan, they should make a little bit more on it than just covers their administrative costs, because some of the loans won't, you know, they're not going to come back. They're not going to get repaid all of their loans. So if that's how banks are operating generally, Lynn's talking about how to bring government credit into that. That the government isn't oh, good. Yeah, a good question came in via text here. Let me get to this in a second. So if the government is, okay, no microphone. The government is, instead of directly giving money to certain projects, the government's making it possible for those projects to get cheaper loans. So what does this mean? It means that if you're looking to get a return, you're making it easier to get a return on projects that are worthwhile. You know, we're going to come. There'll be more on that later on. Let me address this thing that just came in via text, and then let's definitely have time for discussion at the end, because this is a really complex chapter, and it's really important to know it. So Ian asks, what about infrastructure investments which do not give back a return on investment? For example, a giant bridge is constructed to improve transportation. This will not ever pay itself off unless you use a toll system, perhaps. So is new money created by the Treasury only allocated to money-generating infrastructure, like nuclear plants, and not for non-money generating projects like bridges? Although I suppose a loan for a bridge could be made to a city or a state, and then the city or state would be able to pay back the loan through taxes. What about this? That's a really good point. Lynn talks in a couple pages about how direct government expenditures should only be for if you're having microphone problems, I muted everybody, so you might have to unmute yourself if that's why you can't speak. That the only direct expenditures by the government generally should be for basic services. So infrastructure, you're right, that is a legitimate direct government investment where you don't have to always, worry about whether it's getting paid back or not. Although in many of these examples, like the TVA as an entire system, some parts of it made money, many of them didn't. I mean, if you have a dam and it prevents flooding, you don't charge people for not having a flood. You don't have a toll. Like if there's a large rain and then the dam stopped the flood, you don't go to every house and say, if you don't give us money, we'll bring a helicopter and pour a bunch of money on your house. That's what would have happened if we weren't here. It's just you don't charge people for that. But even the TVA, just the aspects that did directly generate revenue, the power generation, that paid for the whole TVA project, and then some. The increased income taxes that people paid from the area because the economy got so much better, that paid for the TVA. So the TVA paid for itself. Winning World War II paid for the TVA, right? So, that's an example of government involvement where it basically was, the TVA was financed by government guaranteed bonds. It was based on a revenue model that would pay it back. But you're right, some things you don't think about how the specific infrastructure will pay itself back. If you take the freeway system, for example, it's an investment. It does have a dedicated revenue stream that pays for it overall. The gas tax is used nationally to pay for the highway projects. But yes, good point. Those are projects where the government can get involved directly, and it's not only through giving out loans of this sort. Although, if let's say a locality is building a road, the contractor who's going to be actually laying down the asphalt, they could get one of these lower loans. They'd be getting the assistance, getting a loan for their business through this preferred channel, for example. So, yeah, but yeah, very, very good point. There are projects that don't make any money that are worthwhile. And in fact, basic economic infrastructure, if you tried to make it make money, like take water, for example, you could charge a lot more for for residential water, and people would pay it. But is that good for the economy? Like, you could probably multiply everybody's home water rates by 5 times, and people would cut back on their water, sure, but it's not like people are going to stop using water because it costs more. You need water. Maybe you won't shower as often, but it's not like you're going to not use it anymore. Or electricity. We would increase the GDP if electricity rates doubled around the country, let's say. Well, if residential rates increased by 10%, you'd increase the GDP. People would be paying more money to the power companies. It wouldn't make the economy any better. Or roads. You could put a toll on every single road. Does the economy get better because you irritatingly have to pay a toll every time you turn around a street corner? No, right? So basic infrastructure, yes, is not part of something where every part has to make revenue for it to make sense. And in fact, it shouldn't. That's not right. If you're trying to generate revenue and make money, infrastructure is not. That's just the infrastructure. That's the platform on which things occur. So, another question came in. What about science, like NASA, the Apollo program? We didn't get a direct payback from that, so this kind of investment would be made through direct spending of revenues. Would you ever use newly created money to pay for these kinds of things? Another excellent question. Yes, absolutely. A lot of major science is too large to be done by private investors or groups of them. So the Apollo program, obviously that was a national program. Fusion must be a national priority. And if it was something that was small enough that private companies could get it done on their own, it would have happened. Because it's such an obvious thing to work on. but the programs are very large. They cost a lot of money, and it requires a national investment, not just money, but a national investment and an intention to make it happen. And of course, the only reason it hasn't is because it's been deliberately suppressed because we have an oligarchy. That's the only reason we don't have fusion right now. It's not because plasma is hard to work with. It's because a decision has been implemented not to develop fusion. So yes, that's another very, very good point. So let's just take a few more things from the nuts and bolts here. On foreign debts, well, this is part of a more fixed exchange system. When Lynn talks about exchange controls, capital controls, he says that one way of controlling imports is when imports are always purchased in the other country's currency. So if you're buying things from Mexico, you're going to pay for them in pesos. If you're buying something from Egypt, you're going to, actually, I don't know what currency they use in Egypt, but that's what you're going to have to find out, because that's what you're going to be buying it in. Then, since the government is able to control the availability of the foreign currencies, it's a way of basically limiting the possible amount of imports, if you want to control that. And then a question: how do we make fusion a national priority? We have to throw Obama out and eliminate oligarchy. I mean, it's the potential's already there. Enough people in Congress know that it makes sense. The scientists have made their case time after time, and there's just this false idea that the case hasn't been made. Like if you try to understand why we don't have fusion right now, or why did we go to the moon 50 years ago and pretty much not do anything great since then? I mean, we got GPS, that's nice, but I mean, really, what have we done since we went to the moon that's of that scale? You can't understand these things if you don't understand Prometheus and Zeus. If you don't understand, the British Empire is Satan. There is a satanic Zeusian oligarchy that is dominating world affairs, and unless that is thrown off, it'll be impossible to get these things to happen. The reason we don't have fusion isn't because fusion scientists haven't made their case. They have. It's that Zeus doesn't want fusion. Zeus does not want mankind to have fire. So you can have a great proposal, and it'll die not on its merits, but because it would be successful. I mean, some of these lower level people, some of these top environmentalist types will say, oh, it would be terrible if we had fusion. Then there'd be more people. It would be like giving an idiot child a machine gun. That would be their view of eliminating poverty and having more people on the planet if we had fusion, which would be a reliable, safe, limitless energy resource. So to get fusion, we need to just decide as a nation that we're going to get fusion. And we can't do that with a president who says we don't need any fancy fusion. I mean, anybody who would counterpose installing more insulated windows on a middle school in fusion, I mean, that's somebody who does not understand energy flux density, among other things, among the many problems with Obama. It's a different quality of energy, like heat seeping through a window versus controlling the sun and creating it here on Earth are obviously very different things. So, a couple more things here. I'm going to skip I'll skip the thing about the Import-Export Bank. Listen to this. This is on page 132. It's just one sentence, so I'll go ahead and read it. But that middle paragraph on page 132. It says, how do we make monetary policy? He says, the principal standard for policy making in matters of monetary policy is the pre-calculated effect in terms of development of the physical economy as we have defined that up to this point. The way we should make decisions, just to restate it, the way we should make decisions on monetary policy has to be in terms of the physical economy. That's a very basic statement. It's a simple statement. It's a true statement. And yet it's heretical to an economist. The idea that we need to actually make policy based on developing the physical economy. And then you work out how are we going to make the monetary system reflect that intention. I mean, the whole fact that we're not sovereign, that we don't have control over our, through the Treasury, that we as people, we as the United States government, don't actually have a sovereign control over our monetary system, means that we're not a sovereign country. So, then he says that, okay, a couple more monetary and fiscal things here. On taxation, taxation policy like credit policy, he says, this is another opportunity for the government to shape what ought to be done in a general way without having to micromanage it. He says, just because people make a lot of money doesn't mean they should be taxed a lot. What do they do with their profit? So he brings up the investment tax credit. That was something that Kennedy did, for example. Kennedy was big on that. What's his name? Carter had an investment tax credit for windmills, which is all those stupid windmills in the Altamont Pass, up in California there. Those are basically all built under Carter because the federal government gave you a tax break equal to the cost of installing them. So basically the federal government paid for all those stupid windmills that just sit there rusting now. But it makes sense that if people are investing their profits into buying new equipment, into upgrading their productivity, into investing in new technologies, well, maybe you should give them a tax break for it. That's the way to encourage people. It's like charities. The government basically subsidizes charities by giving people tax breaks for donating to them. This is one example of how tax policy then is an indirect way of shifting investments. Okay, and then this beautiful couple paragraphs. Need a volunteer to read the paragraph that goes from page 133 to 134.
Okay, I'll read it.
All right.
This touches upon a principle of natural law, as Cusa, for example, is a leading authority on law for modern civilization. The natural rights of each and all individuals is the proper definition of the term equity, according to such natural law. Is that right? The essential right of the individual is a human right. Who is to say a right premised? I'm sorry.
It's 8 o'clock.
Which is to say a right premised on the quality which distinguishes men and women from beasts. The power of creative reason. The development of the powers of reason in all young individuals up through the level corresponding to modern technology is a human right. The right and obligation of the individual to continue the development of those powers is a human right. The freedom to employ those developed powers in some manner which renders an individual's having lived of durable value to society after that life has ended is a most fundamental human rights otherwise. The value of man goes into his grave, like the value of a mere beast, like the value of a mere beast. It is the human right of each and all that human life be regarded as sacred in principle of practice, and that life be lived to such effect that its contributions to society shall be of continued benefit to humanity generally for generations to come. Wherever some other kind of designated right may conflict with this designated principle of human right, that other must yield. That is the principle of equity under natural law. No contrary definition can be tolerated under natural law.
Yeah, just to repeat one of those sentences, talking about what the greatest of human rights. So we got, we've got these different rights, right? We got the Bill of Rights. That's rights. Now, I don't believe the Bill of Rights mentions the essential right, the development of the powers of reason in all young individuals up through the level corresponding to modern technology is a human right. That's even better than the Second Amendment. The right and obligation of the individual to continue the development of those powers is a human right. You've got the right to do that. That's pretty amazing. The freedom to employ those powers in a manner which renders your having lived of durable value to society after your death is a most fundamental human right. Otherwise, your value goes into your grave, like the value of a mere beast. So, Lynn's having some fun here calling this equity. Equity, if you look up how much money you have, subtract your debts, that might be your equity, how much you're worth, So obviously it means also, it's a more legal meaning, but Lynn's having some real fun here. And then he compares it with the Shylock doctrine, that if you've got a claim that would preclude that of people, then you have to let it go. As he said in the end of that quote that Joel just read, wherever some other supposed right conflicts with this, it has to yield. The highest right of people is the right to develop the powers of their mind and have the opportunity to engage those in having a lasting value of having lived. And that's the highest obligation of government. You think about what a government is supposed to do. Make sure the subway runs okay, have a military, general welfare. What does that mean? The right to have had an immortal life. Now, then he says on page 135, that first full paragraph, because he knows people are going to say, what does this have to do with monetary theory? Why are you bringing this up, Lynn? Well, that's nice, but this is an economics book, not a morality book. Like, if you want to talk to the Pope about that, that's fine, but what about economists? Lynn says, he addresses that. He says, were it to be argued that such a principle of equity lies outside the province of political economy's adopted subject matter, this argument was simply shown to be both false and immorally so. Simply, the principle of equity is another guise for physical economy's definition of economic value. Hence, the government has the moral right and the moral obligation to shape the impact of taxation upon society in the manner which best serves physical economy's principle of economic value, on condition that this application is also consistent with the principle of equity, from which the principle of economic value is derived. So, this doesn't commonly get brought up in economics discussions. How should we shape our monetary policy? Well, you have to start from the right of human beings to have immortal lives where they're able to develop themselves to contribute something of enduring value. That has to shape your monetary policy. You're not going to measure that with GDP. You have to measure that physically. Now, anyway, that's fantastic. He then comes back at the end to the bad guys again. He talks about the foolishness of Hume, not foolishness, the deliberate, awful evil of Hume, of Smith, and Bentham. One of the homework questions is going to be find a original quote, well, not original, I'm there to write it, but find a quote or excerpt from these guys that you haven't heard before that is diabolically despicable and evil, which shouldn't be too hard, from among Hume, Smith, and Bentham. So these guys wrote these books. Lynn quotes this quote of his from Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, where Smith says that God has organized the universe so that we don't have to worry about it. Anybody want to read this quote here on page 130? Got a local reader here.
Oh, 136?
Yeah.
The administration of the great system of the universe, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible things, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness, of that of his family, his friends, his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of these ends, it has been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sake, and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them.
Right, like think about I think we talked about this quote in one of the earlier classes, but think about that amazing thing that he said at the end there, that Lynn added the emphasis to, that these pleasures, these desires, these immediate instincts, they prompt us to apply those means for their own sake. In other words, we pursue our pleasures, we avoid our pains for themselves. We're not thinking of anything bigger, but without the consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. Beneficent means good. So we're doing these selfish things, we're pursuing our own individual pleasures, avoiding our own individual pains, without even thinking all the time about worshiping the wonderful Creator for having implanted in us those instincts that we might thereby become a better and more productive society. He's saying that God made it so that if we do that, the world will get better. Now, that's not true. And Smith didn't really, this thing is like, when people have seen propaganda, right? You've seen, you watch the news. We've seen a lot of it about Ukraine recently. You see a lot of it about everything. Well, you see it in economics departments too. I mean, just because you're not talking about the news doesn't mean that you can lie to try to achieve an objective by lying to get something that you want through the use of those lies. So actually, Smith might, whether Smith thought this or not, his intent in promoting something like this, Lynn sums it up. He says, "Do what you please to whom you are able, and avoid the displeasure of those whom you cannot resist." All right, what's Smith saying here? You're trying to avoid pain. You better not take on the guys in charge. That sounds painful. And by not bothering yourself with those in power, God is working through you to improve the world and make the earth a garden. So stay in your place, and that's really what God wanted you to do. So, and the idea of calling this freedom. I mean, this is a funny thing that people think about. Is what's freedom? Right, there's freedom from constraints. I mean, being thrown in prison obviously is not, you're not free in a certain very clear sense in that example. Being forced to do things by external pressure, or physical force, violence, that hardly seems like freedom. But just pursuing your own desires. Did you choose to have those desires? I mean, if you think about like reveling in freedom and doing exactly what you feel like for a day or something like that, or the typical person's image of doing that, did they decide to have those things that they wanted to do? No, right? Think about your own freedom to have desires that you chose to have. think about your own freedom to develop intentions for your life that you actually thought about and chose to have as intentions for your life, not whatever existed in the weird cultural milieu you grew up in or whatever the contemporary culture is. You know, Bentham said that we should have the greatest happiness for the greatest number, whatever that means. What does that mean? You're going to measure people's, how would he do it? He would do it like a zookeeper tending animals. Oh, good, the baboons seem very happy in their cage. That's wonderful. They don't breed if they're not happy. Make sure all the birds are getting all their bird seed that they like and their yummy little bugs that they enjoy. The tortoise, I don't know what tortoise is, some leaves or whatever they like. The pigs have plenty of mud. They're happy. It's like a zoo. And Lynn brings up this cultural relativism that, that this view of these empires was that each race and class within that race is attributed special kinds of needs, not necessarily the same as other classes or races. For example, recall from the past people talking about, whether it was, actually, slaveholders and racists in the U.S. had said it was actually not good for blacks to have equal rights. Didn't go along with it. They actually wouldn't be happy if we had that. So Bentham's greatest happiness for the greatest number. I'm sure he did not oppose slavery, given his view of people. So anyway, if you got this whole just sort of, hedonistic, everybody's pursuing their own things, it keeps people from taking on oligarchy, from taking on Zeus, and it's certainly not an economic policy. As we've been talking about, you've got specific goals like fusion. Do people just want fusion the same way they might want to, get it on with somebody, or eat a lot of pizza, or these immediate desires that Smith is talking about? Right? It's a different sort of thing. So let's stop here for discussion. I can tell you what I haven't written out the questions yet, but they'll be emailed out by tomorrow. But the general topics of them, I was thinking, would be the gold standard versus the gold reserve system. I was going to give some examples of some different things that could be invested in, and also, or people write their own and rate how important they would be. Like, for example, today, how would we rate the importance of fusion research, developing high-speed rail, rebuilding the old bridges across the U.S.? The American Society of Civil Engineers gives like a D- or whatever grade they've got. How do we, what should we? How do we create a recovery specifically? What should we do? A thing about finding some awful quotes from Hume, Smith, and Bentham. So we can, if everyone finds different ones, that'll be great, and we'll have a nice compendium of terrible British liberals. And then something about imports and exports. So I guess that's what the homework's going to be. So that was a lot. What questions, thoughts, tomatoes?
Hey, I had a thought when you were talking about the investment into infrastructure and stuff, bridge, NASA, TVA, right? And in the organizing, I've always thought of it as a potentially really useful thing to really kind of get somebody to make a breakthrough on monetarism, because it's almost like obviously a lot of our own minds are going into how you set something like that up, but the principle of it is that it's not like some sort of like one-for-one return where you're putting the money in and then you're getting the money back, but that it's actually increasing the capability of wealth for the nation by actually making it easier for us to do the things that we do as a species. And so I've always thought of that as not like a simple like, oh, this will break their axiom about monetarism, but that it can be useful in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because these investments, do they make money? The TVA did, pay for itself technically, but that wouldn't even be the reason for doing it. I mean, a lot of things it could have built that would have, made money, I suppose, but what's going to make the economy better? And that's the key thing, is that, you know, these projects don't get, you know, it's not the same kind of money that you get back. You know, like in the discussion about Apollo, we talked about a few classes ago, or also today. You know, money was invested in Apollo. What was the payback? You know, NASA didn't, you know, sell advertisements on rockets or put a, you know, McDonald's logo on the moon or anything like that. But the, you know, NASA had contracted that firm to try to estimate, well, what's the payback? And, you know, they got this 10-to-1 or, you know, order of magnitude payback figure, that every dollar invested in Apollo created $10 of economic wealth overall because of the new technologies that it introduced. But of course, those $10 aren't the same as the dollar that was invested. So that's the whole thing. When you've got a new, you know, Lynn would probably talk about platforms today. When you've got a higher energy flux density, when you've got a new platform of your society, when you're moving into the actual nuclear era of the economy, and this is the, you know, problem that, you know, Leona points out a lot, is that people think, well, or, you know, we'll have cheaper energy if we've got nuclear. Yeah, true, electricity will be cheaper, but the effect won't be that, you know, you'll use your hairdryer longer every day or something, or, you know, leave the lights on and not care if you turn them off when you go to bed. I mean, that's sort of thinking about, in our current economy, if electricity was cheaper, which is silly, because you're not thinking about, well, wow, we're going to be able to produce hydrogen fuel now and stop burning so much oil, which we should be saving to use to make plastics and other things out of, for example. Or, you know, this is going to change the isotopic things available for medicine. We're going to have breakthroughs in medicine. This is going to change material science. Now we're going to have isotopically tuned materials. We're going to, in a fusion economy, we're not going to have to worry about water, because with a high enough energy flux density, you just take water from the oceans. You know, I mean, you know, do we need to control the weather and learn more about that? Yes. At a certain point, it's the sort of thing you might not even have to worry about that much. And we'll see how, you know, we have to figure out how hard and easy these different things are. But it's been calculated, how much energy would you need for a world with 13 billion people on it, where all of their water came from desalination? And the figure was 800 watts per capita, right? I believe. I remember it was around a horsepower. Anyway, it was, you know, it was in today's current usage in the U.S., it was something like, you know, a few percent of our total energy costs would have to go to the energy for desalinating and pumping all the water that we use. Now, in an economy where we're on average using 10 times the energy that we're using today, it would seem almost insignificant. So you can just see how this, you know, I mean, like, that's what it would mean to be in a fusion economy, for example. You know, just rivers of water coming from the ocean. If it's easier to get them by controlling the atmosphere, then of course we should do that, you know. But that's a lot different than you leaving your lights on at night and not worrying about your power bill. So it's really important, yeah, when we're thinking about, and this came up with the answers people gave in the last homework question from last week about what's a science driver program. That, you know, is it to make money? Like, you know, if you told an economist, well, if we did all these programs, the GDP would increase much more. You know, you'd be right, but you don't want to make the point that way, you know. It will project into, you know, all these numbers that people like to use. Yeah, they're going to, you know, except for Wall Street, yeah, sure, they'll go up, but the real thing is, what level are we at, and then are we increasing the ability of people to be able to play a role in achieving more discoveries in the future? You know, are people in society, are they aware of what's happening? Do people have a cultural tendency to discuss the latest breakthroughs in fusion? You know, people talked about the space program. I mean, in the 60s, that's what people talked about. Kids wanted to be astronauts. When people came over for, you know, dinner, having a party, I'm not saying that's the only thing anyone talked about, but people, it was on everybody's mind. We were going to the moon. That's a big deal, you know? In the 70s, we were making great breakthroughs in fusion. I don't know, I'm not going to say it was as widespread in the social setting as going to the moon was, but it should be. You know, imagine you've got an idea, you want to make something, and your local library has got, you know, a whole machine tool section in it. You know, you go over there with your plans for some things you want to produce. You bring some wood with you, or you can get it there, or whatever. Punch it in, the computer, you know, the computer controlled, you know, drills and whatever. They produce the parts that you want. You can try making something at home. Like, you know, that's like, to be a part of that, to have a culture where we're heading that way. That's the thing to think about. That's what Lynn was saying about equity. Like, people being able to have their minds developed. People have a right to be disabused of their silly errors about politics or economics or whatever. And these people that we're talking to, they have a right not just to live in a society where electricity is cheaper, but they should actually feel some connection to the fact that that development's happening that way. I mean, that's, you know, there'll be different people. Like we talk about, you know, we don't want, you know, Queen Elizabeth wants to kill 6 billion people, destroy 6 billion lives. We want to have, you know, we're talking about doubling it. What kind of people? You know, let's see here. 80 texts just came in. Okay, here we go. This one says, wow. Okay, this is, still coming in. Hey, feel free to send emails too if you want. Okay, it says, what about science? Oh, we got that. I noticed, this came in from Ian. I noticed that Lynn did not mention a third option by which a government can use more money than it has through revenues. He mentioned currency creation and tax increase, but he didn't mention government debt to private investors, treasury bonds, for example. Why did he leave this out? If we could make use of S prime through spending and investments by the government, using money procured by incurring private debt to people buying government bonds, would this be less, they came in out of order, would this be less advantageous than creating new currency? It seems that the use of this mechanism may decrease inflationary pressures in the economy, although government would have to pay more excessive interest on the private debt than if it were to simply create its own money to be used for investment. The rabid free marketers say that this interest rate limitation ensures responsible spending and policy by the government. It seems like this is not true, though. It seems like a clever way to deny the right of economic sovereignty to a nation based on the fear that people are not responsible enough to have such a capability, and thus the money supply allocated to the government should be regulated by the discipline of the market. This seems quite pathetically pessimistic, to deny the idea that mankind could never establish an institution like government which could ever be smart enough to take responsibility for the general welfare through economic policies and planning. Very Smith-like. Also, it seems that if new currency were to be created and injected into the economy in the fashion that Lynn describes through targeted investments into capital goods producing sectors and infrastructure, it would not have inflationary effects. If your productive capacity is increasing faster than the amount of currency which draws on that productive capacity in the economy, then no inflation need be feared. Thanks for the subjunctive. Is this why Lynn didn't mention private government debt? I don't know if that's why he didn't mention that. You're right about inflation, though, and that's the point that Lynn's going to make in Chapter 10, which is, I like it. It's called Briefly on Inflation. It's like 2 pages. He basically says, don't worry about it. Just don't do inflationary things and it won't happen. And he addresses what you're talking about, is that people, this whole idea of national banking freaks some people out. Because, like you're saying, they believe that it would be wrong to let the government just produce money because it might be very irresponsible with it, you know, unlike very responsible Wall Street, of course. And, you know, therefore the government should have to, you know, to borrow. I don't think that these things are exclusive. I think that that's a really good question to figure out between selling treasury bills and then creating credit, how things would be financed. I know that Lynn would definitely not allow creation of currency to pay for any current expenditures. I mean, that's one thing. You don't pay your current bills with credit. You invest created credit in this way. Also you know, selling bonds, etc. Because, like, you know, the TVA was financed that way. You know, through government. There were bonds, but it was the government. Well, Like, some of the details on this stuff would be good to know a little better. But yeah, I'm not sure where you would draw the line between what is appropriate for using government credit directly, like the greenbacks, where Lincoln basically created money and said, "This is money." It's pretty much what he did, versus selling treasury bills.
Well, the other thing is, selling treasury bills doesn't increase the amount of money in your financial system. So you're not going to be able to pay for new production that you created by issuing bonds. Right?
If you got the payback thing, yeah. I mean,
But sorry. But because the function of it is more like what you were describing when you're using the private banking system. The government is trying to get the private banking system to finance projects.
mm-hmm.
That's essentially achieving the same thing as if you just borrowed money directly from citizens through buying bonds and then invest it in something.
Mm-hmm.
So this one seems to be more just a mechanism rather than, because you can do the same thing through the banking system basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are very right. That's what I was thinking. That it's you're trying to engage private investment, Lyndon, given that the mechanism for doing that through the way the credit would be issued. Anything else?
I think it's funny. It's worth thinking about the fact that you have a huge majority of the population that's been brainwashed by monetarism. So therefore, they think somewhat like if they're brainwashed by monetarism, and therefore they're thinking on the idea of freedom that you described, which is a lot like a 6-year-old who says, when I grow up, I'm going to have the freedom to do whatever I want, and I'm going to eat only ice cream, and I'm going to stay up late every night, and I'm never going to go to school or whatever, right? So most people, it's just worth remembering when you're dealing with a population that most people think on the level of children at this moment in this, in our society. It's a terrible tragedy, because obviously it means that they've had this human right revoked to actually advance mentally. And then it also occurred to me that if you think about the way that what Doug raised, how are you going to break people of monetarism? Some of it is what Lynn's doing recently. For example, I mean, don't you have the human right not to be hit by an asteroid?
Right.
The difficulties that we face that we're discussing with the global water system and so on, these really trump any kind of bullshit monetarism. You just sort of clean the slate out of the way, and you can deal with reality. If you approach it from that standpoint of, okay, I'm going to bust your axioms by laying out the strategic reality, whereas it would be a mistake to say, okay, I'm going to bust this person's monetarism by, giving a really clear analysis of Chapter 7. I think that would be, we should have that,
right?
But it's not really strategic if you're approaching it that way.
Yeah, this feels kind of timeless. Well, and this is obviously a 30-year-old book.
Yeah.
I know it'll be an interesting thing to come to at the end is like as our sort of after we've gone through the book, have a sort of like a wrap up or a look back through the thing. Would be to also look at what's happened in the past 30 years. what new polemics does Lynn use? How is he? What are our proposals for today? I mean, it's pretty. Not much has changed in a general sense, but it'll be anyway. That'll be a fun thing to do after we've gone through it. Okay. Well, so it's 8:30, so I think we'll. Unless there's anything else, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And I'll email out and then add to the. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're watching it live, come back by tomorrow evening on the 22nd. The homework will be posted in the video description, and we will see you.
Oh, you can advertise on Sunday.
Oh, you're right. I meant to do that. Yeah, because actually bringing up something from the homeworks. Yeah, on Sunday, don't forget Sunday, 8 o'clock Eastern. We're going to be going through the Riemann's habilitation dissertation, which, going back to the last homework from Chapter 5 in the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, Lynn had said that the most clear statement of a hypothesis of the higher hypothesis was Riemann's 1854 habilitation dissertation, and that's what we're going to be going through on Sunday at 8. Make sure. Oh, also the homework question about producing a circle and a line and a point and inscribing a triangle in the circle. Somebody had written back that this shows that Euclid was full of shit, and I just wanted to make this point again that synthetic geometry isn't Euclid. Okay? So, using a compass, that's not like Euclid wasn't the first person to think of a ruler and a compass or constructions or geometry, and so we're going to be getting at with this 1850 with this Riemann paper on Sunday at 8 o'clock Eastern. Is one of the major things is going to be what is wrong with Euclid, which I'm sure everybody's noticed is very important to Lynn, and also how this paper is a hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. How Riemann is not only making a statement about math, physics, and space, but indeed about how the mind comes to understand those things and what path we need to take to make discoveries about it. So that will also be added to the video description on YouTube. And then there's a video, I made a 30-minute video about the habilitation dissertation. Please watch that before the discussion on Sunday at 8. If you come in with that, it'll really be a lot more fun. So that will be it for now, and we'll see you on Sunday and next Wednesday.